No one could have imagined or predicted this confluence of events just a few months ago, beginning with the COVID-19 pandemic and the public health crisis that unfolded, the ensuing economic crisis, and then the killing of George Floyd, followed by the seismic street protests driving a sea change in public consciousness. CEOs across the corporate landscape have added their voices to this discussion that are determined to use their influence to make lasting change. For over 100 years, the Conference Board has helped the world's leading companies and society at large navigate crises and develop reasoned solutions in our country's interest. Founded amid the labor unrest in 1916, the Conference Board led the adoption of workplace safety reforms, compulsory health insurance, and the 8-hour workday. We were at the forefront of the discussions and conversations regarding opening the workplace to women, people of color, and people with disabilities. Our Policy Center, the Committee for Economic Development, which I lead, helped shape the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II, as well as the Jobs Act of 1946, which set forth workplace reforms. That tradition continues today with our efforts to shape public policy that impacts our workplace, communities, and our government. Given recent events, the Conference Board is launching a series of CEO forums to foster action called Building a More Civil and Just Society. The CEO forums feature CEOs from across the American industrial landscape who will focus on actionable insights to address our societal challenges. Today, we are talking to Crystal Ashby, CEO of the Executive Leadership Council, the ELC, the preeminent membership organization for Black CEOs, board directors, and the most senior Black executives at the Fortune 1000, Global 500, and equivalent companies. She leads the organization's efforts to increase the number of global Black executives in C-suites, on corporate boards, and in global enterprises. She is the first woman president and CEO of the organization and traces her association with the ELC to her own participation in the first class of the ELC's Strengthening the Pipeline Leadership Development Program. Crystal is an accomplished senior executive, board member, and lawyer with more than 33 years of leadership success, significantly in the energy sector. Her corporate leadership experience was gained over a 22-year career with BP, where her roles spanned government and external affairs, law, compliance, and ethics, university relations, and retail. Crystal is an NACD Fellow and member of the International Women's Forum and has or is currently serving as a director on the boards of several organizations. Most recently, she was the vice chair of the ELC. She served on the national board of Genesis Works, the Holocaust Museum, Houston Board, and the University of Michigan College of Engineering Dean's Leadership Advisory Board. It is truly our pleasure and privilege to be hosting Crystal today for this very important discussion. And Crystal, I'd really like to start more broadly, looking at our society and stepping back, looking at our society, and then specifically talk about training and upskilling question. So given the events that followed the killing of George Floyd, how would you characterize the social state of our nation today?
Lori, first of all, let me say it's great to see you. So thanks for having me. I would characterize the social state of our nation today as fractured. I would also characterize it as searching. I think that a lot of things that have been tamped down or politically correctly surfaced have now come to the forefront. As I think about it, I often am reminded that I'm a child of the 60s. And when I was growing up, I saw a lot of what the civil rights movement, what we are reminded of just celebrating Congressman Lewis this past week, all of the activities that Martin Luther King and many others drove, and the way in which it impacted the organizations that my family was involved in, but also the way it impacted us as a family. What I'm seeing now is a drive for change that is different than the ones we've had in the past. They were successful then, they were activists then, but they also didn't get the change that they thought was sustainable, because if they had, we wouldn't be here now. And so I think what we're dealing with now, as Black executives in particular, and as people in America as well, is the increase in how we need to have change happen and how action needs to be taken and how it has to happen quickly. In our organization, what we're seeing is a greater request for our engagement and our involvement, a greater request for Black executives from a talent perspective, a greater request for Black directors for boards. So there's definite desire to see change happen. But the thing that I think we have to think about from a broader perspective is, have we been challenged to a point where we're prepared to make sustainable change, not reactionary change? Have we been challenged to take the work that needs to be done and ensure that this is not a moment in time? I often say that George Floyd's murder was not a one-day news story. It was not a one-week news story. It was not a two-week news story. It was a news story that has to continue on, because it is the reminder for why this change has to become sustainable. And I think that's part of what people are struggling with, which is, so what do we do to ensure that the change actually really happens?
And so to that point, and you mentioned that this has been a long struggle there in terms of civil unrest and fights for justice and equality. Do you think that lasting positive change is possible now? Is this a different time in America?
So I look at how I think we got here to kind of decide if that's the case. I mean, if you think about it, COVID-19 happened, and what we saw was an unexplainable but much higher impact upon the Black community from that particular pandemic. And then we look at the manner in which leadership engages in the Black community and the media attention. And then you look at people literally watching someone who has been hired to protect and serve us have their knee on a man's neck, and we watch this man die. And actually, I sit back and say, so what was different for that particular man who was murdered? Because the list, we can talk about Breonna Taylor, we can talk about Martin, we can talk about the list. What was different? And I think what was different was that 8 minutes and 46 seconds forced people to examine an arrogance, a privilege. That gentleman did not believe there would be any consequences for his actions. And that, I think, was very disruptive for people's psyche. So people want to drive the positive change, and and I think people believe that positive change is possible. But again, I go back to, is it sustainable and not reactionary? And this is not a news story. What we are seeing right now is a clear reflection of what Black people's lives are in America, both at home and at work. And that state is not the same for white people. And again, I would say this is not Blacks versus whites. This is Blacks versus racism. And what we need to get to is that it's everybody versus racism. And so I don't want to miss that. But what I also want to say is George Floyd was murdered. It didn't stop. Black people are still dying at a disproportionate rate from COVID. Black people were killed the following weekend. So our businesses need to think about that. I mean, the reality is our businesses are more likely to suffer from the impact of COVID. The other thing I would say is, early days of COVID, many of us were discussing the fact that people were going to lose their jobs, people would be downsized. And historically, it's always Black people who exit the organizations first. So how do you think about that not being the case and adding more to the situation? We are still disproportionately killed by police, and people are saying all lives matter. Yes, all lives do matter, but all lives are not being killed. This increased awareness will hopefully make the change we need. And it's our job to help enact that change and make sure it's sustainable. But again, what are the actions we need to take to do that? How do we begin to pivot so that we're not going to have this conversation in another 10, 20 years? But more importantly, if we don't do it now, will we put ourselves in a position where we cannot change it? And so I think that I have to believe, Lori, that this is a time where the change will happen. We will stumble, but that we won't stop. And so I have to believe that.
And so what types of changes do you think are the most important to really establish a truly just society that, what has to happen now, who needs to do it, and what role do CEOs need to play? You've spent your entire career in the business community, and now you're training and developing future Black leaders in the business community. What role do CEOs need to play in this, as well as focusing on what changes need to be made?
So I think there are changes from an accountability perspective. Commitments have to be made, actions have to be taken, outcomes need to occur, and transparency about that process needs to happen. I think that what we need to do, there's a couple things. First of all, when I think about CEO ownership, because that's where you ended in the question, CEOs need to actually have a personal plan to enhance their own cultural experiences, because you can't help in a situation that you don't understand. And so to rely upon your Black executives to explain things to you, to help you understand what's going on, to explain the conversations they have at home with their children about make sure you come home, what it means to be driving while Black. They need to educate themselves on what the Black experience is. And that's externally, which is what I was just sharing, but there's also internally. I mean, we've done some work with Korn Ferry on the Black P&L leader that's out there. We've done some work with the Center for Talent Innovation on being Black in corporate America. That work is out there. Every CEO goes into a meeting prepared. So prepare yourself for this. And then I think, a lot of people say, well, listening tours have happened. Keep listening and keep asking the hard questions and keep having the conversations. Don't just say we did that the first week and we're not doing it anymore. Really try to understand what the Black leader experience is like in your organization. You have to have clarity of your position. So we've seen a lot of organizations make amazing statements publicly. We've seen a lot of organizations invest a lot of money. But the question becomes what's happening inside the four walls of your organization. What is your Black talent experiencing? And how are they actually being engaged with? When they are there, do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they have the ability to succeed there? Do they look up and see someone that looks like them so they know that it's possible? What environment are you creating that's going to allow them to think they can be successful? And I think there's something else which is very critical. And we talk about diversity and inclusion, and what I'm talking about now is culture. Diversity and inclusion is something that doesn't necessarily get measured. It's something that your mid-level management can disregard because it's not on a performance contract. What I'm saying now is you have to change the culture of your organization to create the sustainability. And to do that, you have to be willing to stay the course. Oftentimes, diversity and inclusion has historically fallen off what's getting done. If there's a crisis in the business or we're not as successful as we thought we would be and we have to focus because we're a performance-driven organization. But now what needs to happen is you have to make that a part of the fabric of your organization. You have to decide that this change has to happen. And even if it means it's not going to happen by the end of the year, it's going to take a long time, that you're going to stay the course, you're going to stay engaged, and you're going to make sure that you deliver. And there are ways to do that, which we can talk about as it relates to the talent.
And you're on the training side and you're developing the talent. And that is the mission of the Executive Leadership Council. And so how are you addressing these issues and how are you preparing Black business leaders to deal with the type of systemic racism and to make their way through the corporate ladders? What types of lessons and skills do you see as most critical on the training side?
So we had a CEO convening on Juneteenth, and we shared with them the CEO's combat to systemic racism, a framework for success. And there was a lot of information in that book about things to do. But when it comes to talent, I think the critical things that you have to understand is you invest a great deal of money to bring your talent in. And the same investment you made in bringing them in is the investment you need to show them throughout their entire career. When your Black talent comes in the door, oftentimes they may get a mentor or someone may help them through what it means to work in that organization, the culture of that organization. That's not the path necessarily to success. I mentioned earlier being able to see someone in the C-suite that looks like them, therefore thinking they can make it. But there's also the accountability you have for the development of their careers. It's not just their responsibility. We often don't get the opportunities that our peers and our colleagues get. So how are you setting them up for success? How are you ensuring that they're going to be prepared for that next role? Do you have a development plan for them? I call it the Black Talent Protocol. Do you have a development plan? And does that development plan involve giving them opportunities, such as the ability to run a P&L? Because we all know to get to the C-suite, to get to the CEO seat, to be on a corporate board, that's a critical component. Have you ever had a P&L? Are you giving them stretch assignments? Are you saying that because it's a risk to give anybody a new job that they've never had before? It's not just a risk because that person is Black. So are you taking the same risk on them that you take on their white counterpart? And are you developing them? Do they know, and does the organization understand that the highest ranking Black executives in the organization are on the CEO succession plan? And therefore they're being discussed in the C-suite, and they're being assured the fact that they're going to have opportunities to go out and do those jobs, so that when that opportunity happens and the seat is about to become open, when they talk about them in that room, somebody can say, well, yeah, they've done all of those things and they're ready. Or are you going to say, oh yeah, they're on the plan, but we never did anything to help them get there? What is your investment in making them succeed? And how are you talking to your board about it as the CEO? What is the transparency in the organization around this? Are you every other board meeting sharing with them, this is how we're doing this? Are you actually holding people accountable? Are you holding the people that hire talent accountable for making sure that they are looking at their Black talent appropriately? So there's a lot that can be done by executives as they're coming up the ranks to make sure that the pipeline is solid, that your bench is good, and that we used to call it dipping, and that you've provided them with opportunities so that they are ready. And I think that the most critical thing that you can do is have the conversations with them about what they want to do with their careers, and really listen to that and figure out how you help them get there.
And so if you're going to invest in the training of your talent, invest in the follow-through.
Invest in the follow-through and stay the course. Where we fall off consistently is, I used to call it the strategy du jour. We had a strategy when I went to bed last night, and I woke up this morning and it had changed on a dime. This is not a strategy that's a short-term play. And I'll be really honest here, Lori, when you think about it, if you've made these public statements, let's say you're a B2C business, your consumers are watching because you've told them you're going to have change. If you've made those statements publicly, your employees are saying, okay, so what's the change and what's going to happen? You want to have said it for all the right reasons, but you also want to deliver on it. And it's okay to say, we might not get it right the first time around, but if you walk away because you don't, then you continue to be a part of the problem and not the solution. And we have a lot of opportunity right now to actually have change happen, but we all have to do this together. This is not a problem for Black people. Actually, the victims in this. This is a problem for all people. And I will be very clear, we need allies and accomplices to deliver this and get it done. Racism and the eradication of it, the manner in which people get healthcare treatment, regardless of their race, those are things that everybody has to have on their agenda. Those are things we all have to work towards. Those are the things we all have to fight for. So I'm looking for the people that are interested in joining that and making sure we get it delivered.
Crystal, you've had a very successful career and continue to be an agent of change and playing a very prominent role in developing Black leadership. But looking back on your own professional experience, on your own life, for certain, you have dealt with problems with systemic racism in your own life. How did you deal with those? Can you share some of those experiences and what you are incredibly motivated? I would love to know how you've maintained this passion and drive to really be an agent of change.
You know, Lori, it's an interesting question. So I would start with the fact that I was raised by three very strong women. I had my great-grandmother until I was 26. I had my grandmother until 3 weeks ago. And my mom is an extraordinarily strong woman. And I have visions of my mother saying things to me. For instance, when I went to London, and it was a scary experience because I hadn't traveled a lot abroad when I went to go do my assignment in London. And she stood in my kitchen and she stomped her feet with tears coming down her face because she didn't want me to go, saying, "You are as good as or better than all of them, and you remember that. Don't let anybody tell you anything differently." It was making the decision that I would hit things straight on. I remember my very first meeting at Amico when I joined, and I was the only woman. I was the lawyer for the team, and it was a room of 16, 17 white men, and somebody whispered under their breath, "What's this little black girl from Detroit going to tell us about how to do our business?" I had a choice that day. I could let that comment pass, or I could address it. And I made the decision to raise it in the room because it was going to set the tone for our relationship going forward. They were an amazing team. They were really good at what they did. But they had gotten used to someone very different from me, and I had to develop and cultivate a relationship. But I had to develop and cultivate a relationship where they knew I knew what I was doing, and they could trust my decisions, and they could trust the advice and guidance I was giving them. And so I had to actually address it before that meeting ended, and I did it in a very public way. I remember feeling like I could feel in preparation for going into meetings where I was typically the only woman and the only black person, and I could feel the armor clack, clack, clacking onto my body. And I remember the first time I didn't feel that. It was because I walked in and just basically said, "This is who I am, this is what I do, and I'm really good at it, and I'm a part of this team." And so I think what I would say is, historically, it's believing in myself, but I will also be very honest and say I had someone else who believed in me as well. As my career developed, I had someone who hired me, became my mentor, ended up being my sponsor unbeknownst to me, because unlike now, back when I was doing this, we didn't know who our sponsors were. They were the silent voices in the room. But somebody who saw me and saw what I was capable of and made sure the kinds of things I talked about earlier that we want for these young people, the experiences that I needed so that I could go to the next job, made sure I got those opportunities and basically said, "I'm sure she can do it, so let's just give it to her." And I delivered. The other thing was saying yes. When opportunities presented themselves, you have to be willing to step in that space and you have to say yes. But a lot of it is around making sure that you surround yourself with people who will tell you the truth. I have what I call my personal board of directors. And those are people who've known me long enough to know exactly when I'm not being honest with myself. The people who can say to me when I give them a situation, "You don't understand, that's not about you, that's about somebody else, so stop taking it personally." Or they're also the people that say, "Yeah, you're right, we need to get your resume ready because maybe this is not a good place for you." So it's also making sure that you have people who know you well enough and are going to tell you the truth when you're going through this journey, because navigating corporate America is not easy. It can be done, but it is not easy. And you have to have places where you know there's safe spaces to talk about how do you manage through this. And so I relied upon all of those things to make sure I had the kind of career that I wanted to have. And I was very, very fortunate because I feel like I had an amazing career. Does that help?
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Crystal. And you know, your leading message is it's on all of us, and we really need to have change. It's on all of us to make sure it's sustainable, and it is way past time for it to be sustainable. Thank you so much for joining us. This was truly our privilege to have the opportunity to talk to you and get guidance on how we move forward on these issues. Thank you so much.
Lori, thank you for the opportunity.